I'm Susan Elkin. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm education and training editor at Stage. I've been an English teacher for many, many years before I went into full-time writing. I'm an author of books, over 30 books, mostly about English teaching and textbooks for children, and most recently a book about theatre called So You Want to Work in Theatre, published by Nick Hone Books. You start by looking at a play, oddly enough, by thinking about the audience that you're going to review it for. Because obviously, if I'm writing a review for the Stage audience, which is mostly theatre professionals, I don't actually need to tell them the story of The Merchant of Venice. If, on the other hand, I'm reviewing for a magazine that's going to be read maybe by quite young students who are new to theatre, then I might need to fill them in on some of the background of the play. So I think the first starting point is who is going to read the review that I'm going to write based on this play. When you look at the play itself, you look for things about it which make it interesting and compelling. I mean, to put it in a very simple way, was I interested in this play? Did I enjoy it? Or was I bored? I mean, I'm a great devotee and lover of Shakespeare, but I have to say I have seen versions of Shakespeare plays in which I have been extremely bored and very glad when it was time to go home. The fact that it's Shakespeare and I love Shakespeare doesn't necessarily make it good. So first of all, you're looking for what's interesting about it and what's holding your attention. I suppose is that you look at the play and think about how you might have directed it. Because if it's your favourite play, you are naturally biased towards the ways that you think it should be directed. For example, I feel very strongly that The Merchant of Venice, which is actually one of my favourite Shakespeare plays, is definitely, most definitely not anti-Semitic. And for years it was not performed by squeamish people because they thought it was anti-Semitic. And if I can be anecdotal for a moment, I worked with the head of English for many years who refused totally to teach it because he said it was simply an anti-Semitic play. And I used to argue with him over coffee frequently, but I never quite won my point because he said my interpretation was going against the grain of the text. So obviously when I go and see Merchant of Venice now, I don't expect it to be presented in an anti-Semitic way, and I'd be very cross if it was. Actually, that hasn't been a problem for a very long time because most directors agree with me rather than with my former boss. Interesting you should ask that, because I recently saw Taming of the Shrew. Now, Taming of the Shrew is definitely not my favourite play. Not because I think it's anti-feminist, incidentally, because I think it is quite a feminist play, because I think Caterina and Petruchio actually do a deal. But there's just something about it, it never quite holds my attention. But the shortened version, pared down, that the RSC are currently touring to schools is very, very exciting. Possibly because they've dressed it cross-gender. So there's all sorts of interesting tensions and nuances going on with who are the men and who are the women. I don't know. But I was able on that occasion to set aside my prejudice and go in with an open mind. But I think that's what you've got to do every time. You've got to, you sit there with an empty notebook when the play starts, and you've got to keep your mind as empty as your notebook. And always bear in mind that somebody's worked extremely hard on this production. It's even if I don't like it, somebody's thought very carefully about it. And it's not really up to me to rubbish it unless there's a very, very good reason. Yes, I mean, there are basic things, aren't there, like the period in which the director and the designer has decided to set it, and whether or not that period, that decision is just a bit of quirky originality because we want to do something different from what everybody else has done, or whether there really is, and that happens sometimes, or whether there is a very good reason for setting it in that period. If you take Measure for Measure, for example, which I always think, particularly the first three acts, is one of the most topical of all Shakespeare plays. Shakespeare actually set it, for strange reasons of his own, in Vienna. But you can set that play almost anywhere where there is tension about sexual morality. And we think a great deal about sexual morality these days in various contexts. So you can very reasonably move the context. Sometimes I think the moving of the context is a bit arbitrary. Midsummer Night's Dream is another play because it's so much of the imagination. You can actually set it just about anywhere you can do anything with it. It's a very elastic play. So you would look first of all, I think, for that, for setting. If you know the play very well, which if you're young you might not, but I tend to look for things like cuts, and I wonder why certain bits are gone, and in some cases I'm quite glad they're gone, like the masks in Tempest, which I always think are really rather unnecessary by the time you get to Act 4, and I'm quite glad if the director has cut them or at least reduced them. Quality of the acting, which of course is partly down to casting. Looking at the actors who might not necessarily be famous, they might be actors I've never come across before. Do they actually work in this particular production? Normally, if an actor's good enough, you can cast almost anybody to do anything, but there are certain constraints, even in Shakespeare, such as Othello, who really has to be a black man. It won't work if he isn't. And most of the rest of the cast have to be white for the same reason, because there has to be a contrast. Like Helena and Hermia in Midsummer Night's Dream. Hermia is quite clearly described in the text as short and dark, and Helena, by contrast, is sort of lanky and blonde. So you want to see that the casting director has put appropriate people in, although it has to be said in most roles, actually, it's the quality of the actor rather than his or her physical attributes. Ensemble quality, because very often when you see a play which uses a large number of actors as maybe some sort of chorus, or maybe doubling up in small roles, or maybe in some cases even acting almost as if they were the set, providing some sort of background visual effect, you want to see how well they're working together. I often think you can actually judge the quality of a play almost by its ensemble work, and by the way that's choreographed, by the way the ensemble move on the stage. And I've seen some lovely ones. Soundtrack and music and lighting. Very, very often there'll be some kind of soundtrack underneath, put by the director or the sound director underneath. It might be music. You've often got instrumentalists, haven't you, at Globe in your gallery. Ask yourself why, what it contributes. It will certainly add to the atmosphere. Do you think it adds to the atmosphere in a positive or a negative way? I mean, I've seen Shakespeare plays where the soundtrack is so loud you can't hear the words. Well, and if you can't hear the actors, it seems to me you've actually lost something. Yeah. Lighting too, which tends to apply less at the Globe, but and in enclosed theatre, lighting directors create obviously atmosphere with lights. Look at that and ask yourself how much it's contributing, or is it in fact distracting, because sometimes it does. Mostly I don't choose the plays I review, I'm sent. Now I could of course always say, no, I really don't want to go to that one, and actually I did the other day, but usually I just read the email, my commissioning editor says go and review this play, and I go. That means that I get to see all sorts of plays and all sorts of work that I wouldn't dream of buying tickets for, possibly because on paper I don't necessarily fancy it particularly, or perhaps it's a company or a play or a playwright I've never heard of, and I find myself at the play seeing something very often, almost always actually, enjoyable, sometimes riveting. Last week I went to see a play called Shooting the Moon by Strange Face Theatre Company, and it's just fantastic. Now, I've never heard of Shooting Mr. Moon. To be honest, I've never heard of Strange Face Theatre Company. But it was one of the most enjoyable nights in the theatre I've had for months. So you just can't tell. And that's the joy of it. You never know. You've got this frisson of what's this going to be like, and am I going to like it or am I not?